Okay, cool. Hi everybody. So if anyone wants to take my chair, you can. There's a lot of people sitting. Um, Thank you so much, Rachel, for having me here and the introduction. Thanks to whoever voted for me. That's really nice. And I was talking to Rachel before this. It's like pretty funny that in my mind, that I'm, for some of you, the first speaker of your PhD program, because this is a highly experimental talk. That's my segue into that. This is not a typical, presentation of lots of regression coefficients, for example. And it actually evolved out of an interaction I had a few months ago. Actually, Dr. Zinzi Bailey was there. And someone gave a presentation that had a very nihilistic orientation towards data and quantitative science as a whole, and really casting doubt on whether it could ever advance any kind of cause that we could consider a cause of social justice. And I kind of intervened and kind of pushed back on it. And a colleague came up to me afterward and told me she was surprised. And it was kind of a breath of fresh air because she kind of assumed that I would take the speaker's view. And I think I have very ambivalent feelings about whether epidemiology or even the larger project of quantitative social sciences or public health sciences can achieve that. But I think it's our job to try to figure out how it can and how it does. So with that said, this will hopefully gradually become clear what I'm talking about. But let's start in 1968 in the San Francisco Bay Area, where a coalition of student organizations at San Francisco State University, the Third World Liberation Front, organized a strike demanding ethnic studies, a Black Studies department, American Indian Studies department, Chicano and Latino Studies department. Through their organizing and through their strike, they were ultimately able to achieve their goals. And those departments exist now. That was replicated by another group going by the same name at Berkeley the next year. And it was an ongoing series of campus-based struggles that were very much aligned with what was then called the New Left and the Black Power movement to create ethnic studies departments. The idea being that institutions of higher education, especially public ones that at that point were largely funded by taxpayer dollars, unlike the economic models today, owed it to people of color, residents of color in those states, to teach them history of their people and in a way that wasn't Eurocentric, whitewashed, etc. And we are in a time of social movements that look in some ways similar, in some ways quite different from the New Left and the Black Power movement of the late 60s into early 70s. And obviously, just something like 10 miles down the road was where Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd, sparking sort of the latest series of Black Lives Matter protests, which some have estimated to be among the largest mobilizations that have ever happened in the history of the US. However, Black studies and ethnic studies as a whole continues to be under attack. There may have been brief periods where cuts that would have happened were eased up on or not as severe as they otherwise would have been. But we're at a time when Black studies in particular is under attack. And we know about Ron DeSantis probably, and he's really, governor of Florida has made that an important piece of his agenda as he's gearing up towards presidential run and trying to outflank Trump to the right. But it's not just in states with Republican leadership, or it's not just a project of conservatives, even though liberals and Democrats in power tend to not be ideologically antagonistic towards ethnic studies. The reality is that the economic model of how public institutions of higher learning are run is such that there are cuts being made anyway. And this here on the right side is a protest that's happening in 6 days from now on this campus, or I guess we're across the street from the campus, kind of, organized by University of Minnesota Students for Democratic Society. There were proposed cuts to ethnic studies departments, pretty steep cuts to their instructional budgets last semester. That didn't happen, and they're demanding to protect and increase funding to those departments. Why am I talking about any of this? Because at the same time that ethnic studies is being attacked in universities and their funding is being cut, we have what appears to me, and I haven't looked at the evidence in a systematic way, something different happening in schools of public health throughout the US, which is there is, possibly for the first time in the history of academic public health in this country, more resources being made available to study what's being put under the umbrella of structural racism in health. And that includes, but is not limited to, the National Institutes of Health funding R01 and other grant mechanisms, issuing requests for applications, specifically asking for research on structural racism and health. This would have been unthinkable probably just a few years before. There were a series of faculty searches at many institutions, particularly in the 2021 academic year, trying to hire faculty whose research focus areas included structural racism and health. We have new centers and programs, including one affiliated with this university's School of Public Health about structural racism and health. So I think this is a really interesting sort of moment, and also interesting juxtaposition to think about. At the same time, you have ethnic studies, Black studies budgets being cut. Sometimes on the very same campuses, you have resources being put into schools of public health for programs on, or centers on, structural racism. And why is that happening, and what does it mean, and what's the difference? I think there's a lot to talk about there, and I'm not going to go super in depth right now, but just one thing I would point out is that these aren't necessarily, these centers and programs and faculty searches aren't necessarily coming about through student demands and student organizing, though that has happened to an extent at schools of public health. I was part of an effort at Harvard in 2014 that didn't yield anything at the time, but some DEI trainings and climate surveys. So I think the ethnic studies movement that started in the late 60s was much more organically connected to the departments that came about as a result. And the departments as a result, I think, and also, having the benefit of starting a field out of scratch in some ways, were more explicitly political, were more open to talking about how power operates, to being confrontational, because they were, in their very core, in their DNA, not to be genetic determinist, came about as a result of a radical political structure. Whereas in this case, we have what I think can be thought of as concessions to an enormous social movement, but one that's largely top-down, led by either bureaucrats at NIH, philanthropic boards, or corporate giving in some cases. I do think it's a good thing that there are all these new resources in academic public health for the study of structural racism. I'm not sure how long that will even last, which is another conversation. But given these dynamics, these political dynamics that precipitated where we are right now, to me, that raises some questions. I think there's a moral imperative to do something with these resources that's meaningful to the movements and the people in whose name that they were brought about. So can we? And how does that look? And how does that look in a way that's very different from ethnic studies, whose focus was on political action and pedagogy, where our focus is on research and a particular kinds of research. So can we succeed as a field in advancing causes of social justice and racial justice in particular? Can we succeed on our own terms, which I'm saying to me, by that, I mean, can we quantify anything that is meaningfully interpretable in statistical terms? So I'm thinking about the craft of research itself. Beyond that, can we effect change in a broader society in a way that confronts racist oppression? And also, is it okay to do one without the other? Is the craft of research a form of inquiry for inquiry's sake that you would find in humanities and humanistic social sciences, even though those departments are facing cuts? They can give us those sorts of departments and our own work, even when we're not necessarily informing clear visions of social change. We are potentially, developing a language and a way of thinking about things and informing future research questions. When is it okay to do one without the other? What if a study of relatively low quality is still useful for social change? And I don't have the answer to that. I think it's worth taking stock of the achievements of social epidemiology in terms of what it's already done in achieving racial justice. And I don't want to overstate or understate this. I think largely it has been not quite as impactful as many of us would like. But in finding specific examples, the COVID pandemic, I think, is one where we saw in certain instances prioritization based on a variety of factors for either vaccination or for therapeutics like monoclonal antibodies. In certain states, you had guidelines where there was explicit consideration of race and a prioritization of people of color broadly, based on the idea that people of particular racialized groups experience racism in ways that harm their health. You have some work by Arlene Geronimus, and she had some role in this that is not entirely clear to me, but her ideas about weathering and about how, as a result of racism, Black people and other people of color may age faster than white people on average, and that age alone is not enough of a criteria to base decisions around, in this case, so-called compassionate release from immigration detention or other sorts of incarceration. And that work was used to, in some number of cases, successfully get people out of those facilities on compassionate release. You have the case of chronic kidney disease and how that's the GFR assessment and work saying that, okay, this racial correction in the algorithm that allowed Black people to have to get sicker to be eligible for treatment is racist, and it doesn't work well. And here's a different algorithm that works in a more equitable way. So you can point to specific examples here and there. To me, the big thing social epi has done is more at the level of discourse. I think it is less likely now that journalists, policymakers, regular people will think of racial health differences automatically as innate genetic differences or as a form of cultural pathology. And I think the idea, some vague idea that social determinants of health, whatever that means, shapes health outcomes in a differential way and causes Black and Indigenous people to have poorer health on many outcomes than non-Hispanic white people. I think that has, if not become common sense, then at least become somewhere in the mix. And that's not the result of any particular person or study, and has more to do with the sort of existence of the field and its expertise and the sorts of you know, the sorts of authority that it develops as a result of that. So this is a long title of a book by Stephen Chapin that just describes what I think in a nutshell is like science and technology studies insights. Like, we are scientists, most of us here probably anyway. We are not producing science under conditions of our own choosing. We are fighting for legitimacy. We are subject to issues around funding and politics, et cetera, et cetera. Our culture, our history, all informs the kinds of science we want to do, we are able to do, we can get away with doing. And I think that social epidemiology in the US in 2023, there are certain things that really hold us back in terms of doing work that can affect change and can fight against racial injustice. We're not big on theory. And when you're talking about complex social phenomena, you kind of need a lot of theory. And when I say this, I'm not, there is theory out there. I'll point to some very concrete facts. A journal article in our field ranges from something like 2,000 to 4,000 words. You can't say all that much about theory in that amount of space. Grant applications, serious word limits to contend with. So even on that level, we're also not a book field. We're also not a field that reads a lot of books, or if we do, we don't talk about them with each other all that much. On top of that, we have a very individualized model of science, an entrepreneurial model. And for more about this, I refer you to an article by Eric Baker on political economy of scientific planning. Science is a collective endeavor. There have been models, either thought of or enacted, that were more centrally planned, where groups of people could come together and think about, here's what the field needs, and approach it systematically with everyone taking slices. That is not the model that exists in the US. And this article shows that it was a quite explicit and political choice to structure the National Science Foundation and National Institutes of Health at the end of World War II, at the height of McCarthyism, anti-communism, against any kind of central planning, and into an entrepreneurial model where we're all basically Shark Tank contestants who have to perform in front of these study sections and please them. And we have to brand ourselves, and we have to do certain kinds of things to get that money. And that money funds your salary if you work at most schools of public health in the US. It's called soft funding. Sorry to scare all the incoming PhD students. I think there are some real tensions around trying to reconcile questions of social causation with modern standards of counterfactual causal inference. I'm not going to get that deep into this, but there's some I would refer you to recent articles and annual reviews, once by Anna Diaz-Rue, another very recent one by Gabe Schwartz, rather. There's a Sharon Schwartz and Seth Prinz book forthcoming about this. I think we're at kind of early stages of reconciling these things to the extent that they can be reconciled. And I think we have underdeveloped theories of change. We either don't think about how our work will be useful, or we have the assumption that benevolent elites, whether they're typically democratic politicians or people who are managing philanthropic foundations, will see our ideas and will do something evidence-based with them. And sometimes that happens, but that is not usually how social change works. But I would point out a countervailing trend here, which is graduate student unionization efforts and people, I think, in these programs for the first time, or for the first time in decades, are getting firsthand experience understanding how to do hands-on organizing work, especially in a situation that involves contesting powers. So not everything is, persuasion. Sometimes it has to do with shutting things down. I am going to talk through two examples of types of studies that are proliferating, and that I, in my personal opinion, think illustrates some of these shortcomings. This is not to single anyone out. I have done work like this myself. This is just to say, like, here is the structure of the field, and here is the studies it's producing now that structural racism is on the radar. There are now many dozens, at least, of studies trying to measure structural racism as such at an area-based, in a geographic area, using what they conceptualize as an index or scale of structural racism. Often, but not always, these are aggregate measures that bring together many different non-health social indicators. So inequality in incarceration rates and employment and education, et cetera. There are other approaches out there. And then there's some attempt to fit a regression model and estimate an association with this structural racism index or scale, and some health outcome among Black people or other racialized people, or the size of some kind of racial inequality. And I think this is where some of the under-theorizing in our field comes to haunt us, because there are so many implicit assumptions in this approach that are simply never addressed. One, that structural racism can be meaningfully quantified as such. By that, I mean that structural racism is a thing out there, and it's an undifferentiated thing, or it's a thing that is composed of many different parts that all add up to this thing called structural racism. And we can say, this county is more structurally racist than this county. I think that is kind of a category error. It's often treating racial inequality as synonymous with structural racism. Structural racism is a relatively simple concept. It's a very profound and important concept. It came about, if you go back to Kwame Ture's book on institutional racism. This was rising Black power movement, real movement of the center of the Black freedom struggle into the Northeast and West Coast, and in areas that hadn't had Jim Crow segregation, as a way of theorizing and pointing out that racism doesn't just happen on interpersonal terms. At a time when there was so much emphasis on that, including by foundations that were trying to, as one book title puts it, go from conceptualizing racism as power to as prejudice. So this isn't a really important concept, but is that really what we're measuring? And I'm going to say no. And I'm going to go into that a little more. There's the implicit assumption, usually, that racial inequality should be measured on a multiplicative scale or some kind of ratio measure. And there's really no explanation as to why. That's a convention in the field. But it actually makes a huge difference which way you look at it. Minnesota is either one of the worst countries in the country in its Black incarceration, if you look at the ratio of Black to white incarceration rates, or it's a relatively less bad one if you look either at the additive scale of Black-white inequality, or if you look at absolute Black incarceration rates. So which one is it? There's the assumption that places with larger Black-white inequalities in social outcomes have more structural racism. And maybe that seems like that would be obviously true, but there is a tradition of theorizing about racism that says racism is a tool to form in an alliance between white workers and white capitalists in ways that simultaneously benefit and harm white people. So there's no theorizing about that. Really straightforward example, most scholars or many scholars of the social welfare state in the US attribute in large part, this is now common sense in that field, the relative lack of a social welfare state in the US to racism and how it was effectively mobilized against social welfare programs and policies. Certainly that's harming a lot of white people, even as other white people or even the same white people are also benefiting from racism. So to me, it's not obvious that the same place should have, white people doing much better than Black people for that to be the most structurally racist place. If we can even think that way, which I'm suggesting we shouldn't. And then there's the bit I'm going to gloss over, like this isn't an explicit counterfactual framework, maybe it doesn't need to be. As kind of a not exactly counterexample, but a sort of different way of looking at the same kind of question, I'll point you to something not from public health, but from economics. Laura Durancourt, who I met as a union organizer at Harvard. She did this really cool study, I think, called Can You Move to Opportunity? And it is examining structural racism, but is not purporting to measure structural racism. It's using a specific historically situated social process, which is the Great Migration, 1940 to 1970, of Black people from the South into cities in the Northeast or Midwest or West, to understand how that changed intergenerational mobility in later decades. And also how that changed spending on carceral expenses versus things like education and social welfare state. And she finds that if when there was more migration of Black people to a particular city, they responded in a particular way that involved things like moving outside of city borders or withdrawing white students from public schools and growing private schools and defunding public programs in a way that decreased intergenerational mobility in subsequent decades. So this is about structural racism because we're not simply talking about the attitudes and prejudices of individuals. We're talking about how racism operates through policy and institutions. But it's not purporting to measure structural racism in a direct way. Instead, it's saying, and it draws on, there's so much theory and sociology around group threat, or what's called minority or racial threat, and how white people and wealthy white people in particular kind of maintain their status. It's really drawing on that tradition, which is not something I really see very often in public health. But this approach to the structural racism index follows a lot of conventions. We are big on psychometrics in general because of the influence of psychology on our field. We have done a lot with studying segregation, and there are indices of segregation that make a lot of sense because segregation is both a social process and an outcome that could be directly measured. Another example is looking at the effects of police killings on health outcomes among a much wider, broader population. Usually this is conceptualized as the effect of police killings of Black people on Black people in the local geographic area. Sometimes it's national. There are many different ways this gets conceptualized. And it's very common to do it now with birth outcomes, preterm birth, small for gestational age, low birth weight. There's about a dozen studies like that. There's also some studies on mental health outcomes, emergency calls for service, which is you can think of as sort of a public health-ish outcome. And this kind of uses, these use what are usually thought of as quasi-experimental methods, because there's a very distinct period when the exposure happens. And if you're talking about pregnancy, there's a very distinct ideologic period for that. So you would think that some of these hand-wavy things we do over usually not knowing ideologic period or it being the entire life course would make this a much more rigorous study design. And I think it is. And I've looked at some of these studies and I thought that they were really cool. But something keeps happening, which is that there are skeptical people out there on this kind of research in particular. When you do research that is, can call it politically charged, euphemistically, you will draw skeptics that may have otherwise ignored your work. And what happened with, I'm thinking of two papers in general, one of which was retracted, one of which was not. You had other groups going in. They used data from Fatal Encounters, which is a newspaper-based, a media-based database of police killings. And they said, wait, if you go line by line and look at all the deaths that should have been included by your own definition, this handful shouldn't have been in there. And then they rerun the analysis and find, oh, you no longer see statistically significant results. And should you be going by statistical significance is another question. But the fact that these studies, some of which really impressed me, the one that was retracted really impressed me when it first came out. It used like a fixed effects within birthing person design for some of the analyses. And like, that was pretty convincing to me, but apparently it did not hold up. And part of what's going on is that there's a high degree of what, I'm borrowing these terms from the statistician Andrew Gelman, model uncertainty. So we don't really know the causal model here. Is it what kinds of police killings are going to be affecting pregnant people? What kinds of pregnant people are going to be affected? There are assumptions made about that, usually that Black people will be more affected than white people, that people nearby will be more affected than people far away. There's many different ways to model it, many choices you can make. If you were to think about all the ways you could do this, you would be in the thousands and they'd all be reasonable. And we are not really dissuaded in our field from sort of following the data and following what seems right at the time. And the term p hacking has garnered a very negative reputation because it kind of has come to apply fraud or misconduct. And that's not what I'm talking about at all here. I'm talking about doing what we all do with observational research, which is make the analytic choices that seem to make sense at the time. And that will sometimes yield results that are not robust to further scrutiny. And also all these studies ignore temperature as a time-varying confounder. Temperature is actually a pretty strong cause, I'll put it out there like that, of adverse birth outcomes, of poor mental health experiencing at a particular time, and of police killings. And it turns out to be really hard to control for temperature. Is it the maximum temperature that day? Do you use the heat index? Do you use the wet bulb temperature? Do you look at a heat wave over time? Do you look at if the temperature is sustained at night? So it's even using the most rigorous methods out there that you would think would answer this question in a really straightforward way is really hard. And this is not specific to research on structural racism and health. This is a big problem in all areas of quantitative social science. But the question I really want to get at is why even ask these research questions in the first place? Are these the research questions that are going to advance the field intellectually, or more importantly, in my view, to actually like produce beneficial change that that helps people on the ground who are doing movement organizing, pass policies or win concessions or whatever that's going to lessen racial inequality, attack racism, however you want to think about it. These kinds of questions are following conventions in the field that are established. We as social epidemiologists have this issue where we are struggling for legitimacy within a world that's so dominated by medicine, by pharmacoepidemiology, by lifestyle interventions and that kind of thing. The idea, we're often in situations where everyone around us is not a social epidemiologist, or the people who are making funding decisions, they don't get it. They don't get questions about social causation, let alone questions about racism. So the way to make inroads, and perhaps it's necessary, is to follow established conventions that have shown confer us legitimacy and therefore material resources, ranging from money to jobs to acceptances in major journals. These are also questions that are not that expensive to ask because the data is already out there. You get birth data from CDC. You can get data on police killings from various websites. It would take more money and more funding to better assess the outcomes we might think are more important, perhaps, maybe millions of dollars. And to date, NIH this is starting to change a little bit, has funded very little research looking at policing as an adverse either exposure or outcome. There is, I think, merit in these questions. I think they do help us intellectually advance the field in some ways, but I don't think, because everyone is doing their own thing, and it's, there's no place we come together and say, okay, this is the agenda of social epi research on structural racism and health for the next 5 years. So we are doing important intellectual work, but not in a coordinated way per se. But I would say there's so many other questions out there that should be relatively straightforward. For example, what happens to people who are injured by police and aren't killed? What's happening to their health? How much cost do they incur? That's a really important question, because in civil lawsuits against police, when people who have been injured by police are assessing their options, and I was just hearing about a case of this recently, they think, okay, I'll take the $100,000 settlements, not knowing that in 20 years they won't be able to work because of their physical disability will still be with them, or psychological disability. But yeah, we haven't asked that question. And I'm going to power through because I am going not leaving enough time for questions. What I want to highlight here is, I think there's other ways of thinking about the role of epidemiology in general. We're often concentrating on, if we've done well, we have provided evidence that produces a public health intervention. But I think there's another really important role that gets overlooked and that maybe can help here, which is trying to attribute harm. So harm could be as granular as harm to a particular individual caused by a particular workplace or exposure or company or industry. And this has enormously consequential impacts in our field. This is actually the main way, I would argue, that public health changes have happened in recent decades, especially with the pretty moribund regulatory state. You have the master settlement agreements from the tobacco industry, big settlements in lead paint, the Purdue Pharma and Sackler lawsuit. I'd also note the Chicago reparations ordinance for victims of police torture of Commander John Burge, who were all Black men who were tortured, who now have access to psychological counseling, and there's curriculum about police torture that's put in place. There's supposed to be a memorial constructed. It hasn't been there yet. So we, as a field, sometimes without knowing it, our work informs arguments about the attribution of harm that serve as an important part of political and legal processes for accountability, whether that's remuneration, whether that's changes to industries or particular companies that come out about as a result of a legal settlement, Or oftentimes when an industry really takes a hit through lawsuits and everything that comes out, like the tobacco industry, it weakens them reputationally and allows for regulation to come in. There is an estimand that you can go your entire epidemiology career without hearing about, called probability of causation. Given that you experienced a particular kind of harm, what is the probability that that person or that industry or that workplace caused it? This requires both statistical modeling and models of biological causation. And there's been a tiny bit of work on it within the field, but normally you see it more in other fields. There's philosophy and statistics and all this work being done on probability of causation. I'm going to go really quick through the last couple slides. Attribution is a critical question in cases of deaths in police custody. The single biggest debate within the criminal trial of Derek Chauvin for killing George Floyd was whether Chauvin actually caused the death. And you had an expert witness, David Fowler, a medical examiner who was previously medical examiner and chief medical examiner in Maryland, arguing, no, it was not Chauvin's knee. It was drug overdose. And maybe he inhaled carbon monoxide from a nearby van. And maybe it was underlying cardiovascular disease. These sets of explanations are extremely common in civil, usually it's civil, but sometimes criminal cases against police departments for non-firearm deaths. And there's an entire set of explanations here that was supported, if not institutionally by CDC and NIH, then by particular staff there. And they helped develop these things. And there's a condition called excited delirium that is largely rejected in the medical community, but is, and pretty much only is invoked when someone dies in police custody, that says, okay, this person had this condition and that killed them in and of themselves. It wasn't the police restraining them and asphyxiating them. There are also claims, particularly about Black people who die in police custody, that it was sickle cell traits, not sickle cell disorder, but it is possible to have only the trait, so inherit only one sickle cell gene. And in extreme cases that you see sometimes with athletes or military recruits, it raises the risk of what's called exertional rhabdomyolysis, which can be fatal. So they're saying, oh, these Black people die in police custody, some of them is probably sickle cell trait. And that actually was used in a pretrial motion, as was excited delirium, for the Chauvin trial. That got thrown out, so they brought in other arguments. There's this, I found a study from 1990 of high-level CDC staff looking into deaths in police custody and speculating that, oh, maybe we're seeing them more among Black people because of sickle cell trait. Never even considering that maybe Black people have more interactions with police and are treated more violently by them. And this is just like a really quick preview of some research I have going on, which is a data set that I can't really disclose that much about, but it is non-firearm police killings or deaths in police custody that follow use of non-lethal, so-called less lethal force. So you have attribution is something that forensic pathologists engage with daily. That is their job, and they're doing it largely without any kind of epidemiologic framework to it. And one of the things that they use to attribute deaths is this category called manner of death. So was this natural result of a disease process? Was it self-inflicted? Was it homicide, which doesn't mean murder or manslaughter, just means a non-accidental taking of a life by another person? Or was it an accident? So for all these police killings throughout the US that follow, or we can call them deaths in police custody that followed non-lethal force, less lethal force, the plurality are being classified as accidents. Only in 29% of the case are they classified as homicide. And among many other things, I found that for those deaths that were classified as homicides by the coroner or medical examiner, is it 9 times the chance that they would result in criminal prosecution against police than if they were accidental. And it's both the product, the manner of death classification, it's both the product of highly idiosyncratic beliefs about how manner of death should work, but also pressure by police on death investigators that they report and sometimes blow the whistle on. And let's get to questions. Sorry, that was a lot, and I didn't leave you enough time. And you can also have comments or complaints.
Thank you so much, Justin. Does anyone have any comments or complaints or even a question? Go ahead, Andy.
So really interesting talk. And one thing I didn't hear you talk about that much, and maybe that's because of the audience, is interdisciplinarity, right? So why is it all on epidemiologists to develop a science of justice or a science of structural racism? And I'm sure you thought about this a lot, so I want to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I'm kind of getting at here. Like, we should be reading how sociologists and geographers and economists have thought about structural racism. And we should also be reading Black studies. And sometimes collaborations, across departments work as well. I think we need to develop for us, what is our personal theory of how we think these social processes are operating, and that's going to be informed by work from these other disciplines.
Part of the reason these indices are so popular is because they don't put specific pressure on any one industry or organization.
Yes, that's a great point, and I thought about adding that bullet too. Yes, I was also thinking it was a little mean to say, but I kind of feel like the idea of miasma as this sort of nebulous in both senses of the term. It looks cloudy, and we also can't really put our finger on what it is, and it's like everywhere and nowhere at once. I think there's a danger of structural racism being thought of as a miasma in a way that does not highlight the particular people and institutions responsible for perpetuating it.
I have a random question and kind of ancillary to maybe some of points that you're making, which I think are really important points for how we push the field forward. And that is around data, right? So I think there's also a balance of like trying to get the data that you would like to see. So whether it's about the Black migration or, merging kind of the historical archive with, the potentially quantitative, but also qualitative components of study. So in some cases, the data isn't as clear, right? And how do you consider that approach?
Yeah, I mean, it's not something I figured out myself, really. Like, what I can tell you what I do myself, which is I am obsessively always looking for cool data and data that may have slipped through the cracks. And that's kind of how I've built my research. And my research isn't very theoretically informed or anything. Usually, I think it has practical applications. So I think it's probably a balance, but there's all this administrative data out there. And also like rare census cuts that are not the regular decennial or ACS data. I hate to compliment economists because I don't like them in general, but they're really good. How many of you in epidemiology file public records requests? Like we have one. I've done it too. That's like a pretty common way in certain fields to get data that we rarely use. So I think it'd be helpful to be more creative about where we get data and more aggressive about how we get data.
I wanted to, first of all, I want to use my, first of all, I want to make a plug. I want to make a plug for all of you graduate students to take social epidemiology. That's going to be coming in the spring, and we'll be addressing some of these issues that Justin has raised. To help you think about these issues. Trained as a social epidemiologist, interdisciplinarity. I wonder about some of the work you didn't talk about. Something the reverse, which is anti-racist. Policy or ways, and Naomi's work, dissertation work, focuses on HBCUs as one example of an anti-racist institution that was born from the racism, structural racism in education, the exclusion of Black folks. So an anti-racist institution arose. Are there other, can you model or have you thought about anti-racism as a construct that can be operationalized, which would be sort of the inverse?
Yeah, I mean, there's some interesting stuff out there. Like, there's research, some by Nancy Krieger, on effects of the abolition of Jim Crow, which would be like a pretty explicit example of that. And yeah, I think part of it is framing, because you can have a continuous sort of measure where like maybe in some places there's so I'm doing some work right now looking at kind of partly inspired by what I showed about the Great Migration, about how local governments spend money. Is it on police and incarceration versus social sector, and how does that map on to like trajectories of Black population? So you can understand that as, I'm trying to get at a question informed by structural racism, but you can also use that same thing to say, like, okay, from what I see here, it's maybe beneficial to concentrate social spending or public spending in the social sector rather than in police and incarceration. Maybe like that could be an anti-racist intervention. Or maybe you see in polities with majority Black populations, you get to a level where possibly resources are distributed differently.
And that tracks with activism. That's a lot of activists have been pushing on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, that's sort of why I'm doing this.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. I already had, and I have this about myself. What do we do when we find results? I mean, these are sort of results that are motivated by a certain outcome, right? A justice outcome. So you go in and you're looking at social spending, partial spending, and you find actually the places that are spending everything on police and incarceration are doing great. I'm not saying that's actually what you find. I'm just curious, like, how do we balance this kind of like a true kind of agnostic curiosity about how the world works, which is really what I think we should be developing some cases in science. And yet we're also trying to align with certain justice outcomes. So I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah.
Well, the flip of that is when you find you're so socially justice motivated, you find an adverse effect of these things that you believe wholeheartedly to be beneficial.
Yeah.
And could be used against movement if it's published, when it's published. What do you do with that? And it's an ethical issue.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's multiple layers there. And it can get to squishy and uncomfortable places. But the layer that I'll highlight, which is maybe a different way of thinking about it, is that it's important to have strong theory. It's important to go into the question having strong priors, if you can use, abuse that term, because you've done the work and you've read the literature and not just the epi literature. And if we think about this in a sort of informally Bayesian sense, you should be recalibrating your worldview in light of the new results, but that should be weighted with your model that you came into it with, especially when our measurements are bad, the risk of confounding and selection bias is high. So I go into any study, especially a causal inference one, saying, I'm probably not going to be able to estimate the kind of counterfactual that I would like to be, but let's see how good we can get. And I'm not going to be that surprised if it looks weird.
To build off that question and ask you something, are you optimistic?
About what?
Social equity and its role in study.
Institutionally, no. But what I am optimistic about is I do think you have more and more people getting into the fields with who come in because they want to make these kinds of changes, and maybe they have some kind of activist or organizing experience, and they grapple with these contradictions, and they email me and they make me Zoom with them for hours. And they're trying to figure stuff out. And I don't know if they'll be able to figure it out within the strictures of being an soft-funded researcher at a school of public health or not. But that, you know, I think that's good.
We are at 11 o'clock. I just want to say thank you so much, Justin, once again. That was the